Alright, today we're going to talk about the problem of evil. That was a request made by one of y'all on week 1.
Huh? Probably. Yeah, I can't remember talking about it. Yep.
So, anyone know what the problem of evil is? It is a problem.
If God is loving, why does he let evil happen?
How does an all-powerful, all-loving God allow evil to exist? Problem of evil. To write it in a logical form, you would say that the premises are: premise 1, God is all-powerful. Premise 2, God is all-loving. Premise 3, evil exists. I knew it was dying. I have prepared for this. I have a backup marker. But if this one dies, then class dismissed. So. The claim is that these 3 premises create a contradiction. And because they create a contradiction, the conclusion can then be God does not exist. So that's the proposed problem of evil. Fun fact about the problem of evil, it actually predates Christianity. As far as I can tell, when I've looked into it, the earliest writing of the problem of evil came from Epicurus, or Epicurus. I have no idea how his name's pronounced, but I have heard all 3 of those pronunciations from professors. So one of those. He was a Greek, and the way he wrote it was, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is not malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? And I would say that's a pretty good argument. Actually, from a historical perspective, that is the best argument against theism that philosophers have ever developed. If you ask any apologist, if you ask any philosopher, if you ask any theologian, what's the best argument against the existence of God? It's the problem of evil. This is a problem that philosophers wrestled with for thousands of years. Now, I do happen to have the benefit of history on my side, that in 1979 the problem of evil was disproven. There is no logical problem. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I say that just to confess, since that was in 79 and I was born in 96. I was born into a world where it already wasn't obvious why this is such a big deal as a logical problem. But as a trained mathematician, when I learned logic, when I learned formal logic, I immediately saw this doesn't make sense. The problem of evil written logically is invalid. So let me give an example of an actual problem. This marker looks like it's dying too. I don't think blue is going to show up at all.
Oh, whoa! We're doing blue today.
Yay!
Good call.
So let me give another logical structure, and then we'll talk about what actual contradictions look like. So, all men are mortal. We talked about this one a month ago. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. And what we talked about a month ago, I was explaining what a syllogism is. We deduced the conclusion from these 2 premises. But rather than that, I can make a set of premises that are contradictory by having a premise 3 that is Socrates is immortal. These 3 premises make a contradiction. The way you can tell that is you can pick any 2 and you can say what follows logically? What can you deduce from it? So if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, the conclusion from those two premises is that Socrates is mortal, which is the antithesis of the third premise, right? But similarly, if I take these two premises, Socrates is a man and Socrates is immortal, then one conclusion I can draw is not all men are mortal, which is a contradiction of the first premise. And then likewise, if I say all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, or I'm sorry, all men are mortal and Socrates is immortal, then the conclusion I get from those two premises is Socrates is not a man, which is a direct contradiction to the third premise. So if we try to do the same thing to point out a contradiction in these three premises, let's pick two. God is all-powerful and God is all-loving. What follows from logical necessity?
God is both all-powerful and all-loving?
Then that's it. The only thing they can draw from it is that they're both true. Nothing's really explicitly deducible from that. God is all-loving and evil exists. What follows from that? For it to be a contradiction, what follows has to be that God is not all-powerful, but does it? God is all-loving and evil exists. What follows from that? Well, possibly that somehow evil is used for love. Like, that's a possible explanation, right? That's not a logically deduced explanation, though. That's a inductive argument. It's not a deductive argument. Likewise, you could say maybe that means God is not all-powerful, but again, that's not deductive. It doesn't get forced from the premises. And so, to throw the punches a little bit ahead of time, what Alvin Plantinga did was, what's the name of the book? The book was God, Freedom, and Evil. So in the book God, Freedom, and Evil, Alvin Plantinga, 1979, he actually, rather than just talking about it the way that we're talking about it, he showed a formal logic proof that there is no possible contradiction in those premises. So that's the big what he did. So what's happening? Why is the problem of evil so big of a problem? Since logic is as old as the Greeks, as far as our formal structure of logic, then how come the Greeks didn't recognize that this was not a contradiction? How come the Greeks didn't just showcase what Alvin Plantinga showcased and then move on? Well, what must be happening is that people are operating with some unspoken assumptions around these premises. And so maybe we need to define terms better. Maybe we need to pull out the assumptions. I'm going to talk through Epicurus' example, because Epicurus, in his articulation, is operating with some assumptions that if you don't recognize them, his argument sounds really good. So, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not all-powerful. Is he able but not willing? Then he is not all-loving. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? So the first line, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not all-powerful. Is that a true statement? Is it true that if God wasn't able to prevent all evil, he wouldn't be all-powerful?
Yes.
Maybe.
I'm actually going to argue and I'm going to show that's not a valid statement. However, even if it was a true statement, is there anything in it that Epicurus is implying that he's not actually saying? I would argue that
God would prevent evil if he could.
yeah, Epicurus seems to be operating with this assumption that if God can prevent evil, then he should, right? That he ought to prevent all evil. In the second line, he says, is he able but not willing? This is assuming, like the implicit statement here is that evil should be prevented. Okay? So Epicurus is operating with this frame that evil has no utility. That there is no possible good to come from evil. Well, Christians, is that true? Do we know of any counterexamples of evil being used for good?
Like in scripture.
Sure.
So when the brothers, in the Old Testament, when Joseph was kind of taken away, they came later and apologized, and then he said literally to his brothers, what you meant for bad, God used for good.
Yes. Depending on translation, the actual words there are evil and good. Yeah. What you meant for evil, the Lord meant for good. Right? So we actually know of explicit examples in Scripture of things that were evil being used for good. And it's also not hard when you understand at least Epicurus' definition of evil to come up with infinite number of examples to where he's wrong. Because Epicurus was, and I'm not saying this the way we use it casually today, I'm saying this as the actual philosophical position that he held. Epicurus was a hedonist. He held the position of hedonism, and he defended it, and he articulated it. And hedonism would defend that anything that causes pain or suffering of any form is therefore evil. So, if you need to get a root canal, because if you don't get it, the infection in your mouth will kill you. But root canals are very painful. Epicurus would say that's evil and you shouldn't have the root canal. But clearly, it is something that causes you pain that is for good. It's easy to come up with counterexamples, at least to the pain and suffering definition of evil. There's plenty of examples of pain and suffering being used for good. Another really easy example is every single time one chooses to work out. Causes pain. It's a good thing. And the Greeks were pretty obsessive about physical fitness. Who was it? I think it was Aristotle who said that it is a shame for a man to live his entire life without knowing the capability of his body. And that it is, therefore shameful and immoral to not be in the best physical shape possible. Yeah.
Is his implication then that discipline is evil? Discipline is uncomfortable, and that's something we have to do. So what he's saying is inconvenience is evil.
Yeah. And that would be a formal hedonist would defend that, and they would try to make their case philosophically. Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more. Epicurus I wanted to talk about his because as far as I can tell, it's the oldest writing of the problem. But regardless, I also think it's the most poetic, and therefore it has more stomping power than most articulations. But he has those underlying assumptions. Now, I'm curious if we can deduce what the underlying assumptions are in the formal argument that allow us to say that there's a contradiction and God doesn't exist. Because if we can figure out what the assumptions are, then maybe we can talk about the assumptions, and maybe, because there is no logical problem here, maybe we can figure out what makes the logical problem, and that can give us some power to respond to people. Because, let's be honest, there's no logical problem isn't a very satisfactory response. Kind of, well, no, I think there is a problem. It's going to be, that's going to be the tension, right? So if we can figure out what's making people think there is a problem, maybe we can be more helpful towards responding to it. So I'm going to list what I believe are the assumptions that are being added to this argument. Okay.
While you're erasing, can I comment something?
Yeah.
I think just for me, that in of itself, those three, what did you call it? They're parameters, or what does the P stand for?
Premise.
Those premises, I think those all three can all exist at the same time. Because if there is a serpent in Genesis, then we know that there was evil that already existed. So God can be all powerful, all loving, and evil can exist. Is that a good way to think about it?
Well, we just talked about it. There's no logical contradiction.
Okay,
And
maybe I misheard you. I thought you said there was one that...
So
I'm going to try to unpack the assumptions that are being made that'll lead people to believe there is a contradiction. Because if we can figure out why people think there's a contradiction here, then maybe we can respond to the actual problem, since there is no contradiction in the premises. Right? I'm going to rewrite it, because I want more space between my premises. Bye, baby.
I think it's weird that you're whispering. You could just talk.
I just don't think the camera needs to hear.
This is the mic.
I don't know how I didn't see that.
Yeah, that records the video, but this records the audio. Okay.
Before I actually try to write out what I think's missing that makes the argument actually work, any guesses based on conversations you've had, thoughts you've had? Do you think there's anything that the way that I talked about Epicurus' assumptions, he's saying evil should be prevented at all times. Any guesses what might be missing that people think is embedded in this argument?
To make it solid.
Mm-hmm.
My guess would be that God is not interactive or personal.
I don't think that assumption's being made. I think when you say God is all loving, you assume that he's personal.
Evil's not loving.
Okay, that's reasonable. Evil. I think what people are saying effectively, and I think you're right there, is God has the capacity to prevent evil. He would want to prevent evil. There's never any good reason for evil, but there is evil.
Right.
So one of the assumptions is probably that there's no good reason for evil. Right? And you can see how if there was no good reason for evil, that would change the argument. So I think one of them is there's no possible good to come out of evil, which I would actually say is the hidden premise 4. Premise 4. There is no possible good to come from evil. I think there's another assumption people make, though. I think the other one's just as important to understand and be able to unpack. And I'll help you a little bit. I think there's an assumption people make with the idea that God is all-powerful. I think that people believe there's a corollary to that. There's something that means that bolsters their argument.
Any guesses?
I had a guess and then I was like, no, but that evil exists already kind of answered it for me.
Okay.
In logic, a corollary is something that follows from logical necessity from a single premise. And so often when you're writing a logical argument, you will expand a corollary to make the point clear. It's not formally necessary if the corollary is true, but it's almost always formally done for clarity. So the corollary that I think people are assuming works is that because God is all-powerful, he can make any world he wants. And here's why I believe that this is the proper formation of the logical argument that people present. Because if God can make any world he wants, and there's no possible good to come from evil, but evil exists, that seems to be a contradiction. Like now that we have all of that together, we actually have a formal contradiction. Right? So a formal contradiction, if you take all the premises, they negate the other premise. Like take all the premises but one, it will negate the other premise. So God is all-powerful, can make any world that he wants, is all-loving, but evil exists, and there's no possible good to come from evil. Now we actually have a formal contradiction. Then evil exists is the punchline. It's the problem. I think this is what people think when they say, how does an all-powerful, all-loving God allow evil to exist? So, is premise 1 true? Is God all-powerful? Yeah. Is premise 2 true? Is God all-loving? Yes. Is premise 3 true? Does evil exist? Yes. So, what we want to do is discern whether the corollary or the hidden premise are true. Technically, if either of them is false, we don't have a contradiction anymore. But I think it's important to know that both of them are false. So, let's start with the corollary. God can make any world he wants. So, in philosophy, we have this concept of a possible world. So you can think there are all these possible worlds. And one of these possible worlds is the actual world. A possible world is just a world that is logically coherent. It works logically. And the distinction between a possible world and the actual world is whether or not it exists. Okay. So, for instance, unicorns don't exist. But there's nothing obvious that would make it a logical contradiction that they do. So unicorns exist in a possible world. There's a possible world where there's unicorns. It's just not the actual world. Okay. So when we talk about a possible world, we're just talking about what's logically coherent. Okay. So God can make any world he wants is not true. And it's not because God doesn't have the power, but it's because the worlds that God can make are the logically possible worlds. God cannot do the logically impossible. And that's not a redefinition of omnipotence. That's what it's always meant historically. And the reason is really simple. God can't make a married bachelor, someone who is both single and married, because it makes no sense. It's not a limitation of power. It's just a limitation of rationality. God can't make a square circle because they're contradictions of terms. God can't will against God's own will. It just simply has no coherent capacity. So God can't make any world he wants. He can only make logically possible worlds. So why is this important? Well, in the context of this discussion, is it possible for there to be a world of free creatures with no evil? Well, I don't know the answer to that. But I will tell you that in order to defend the problem of evil, you have to be able to prove, yes, it is. And that's a tough thing to prove. And here's one of the reasons why I'm kind of leaning towards probably not. In this world, there were two free creatures, and they both did evil. It might be that it's logically impossible for a free creature to never do evil. That might actually be a logical contradiction. Because to do good is to do the will of the Lord. To do evil is to do anything contrary to the will of the Lord. And if you are only ever doing the will of the Lord, it's debatable if you're free. Maybe you are. It's a tough one, though. God cannot make any world he wants. It might be that of all of the possible worlds, there are some where no free creatures do evil. And those possible worlds might not have any free creatures, might not have any creatures, might have other overwhelming defeaters. Maybe there's a possible world where no free creature commits evil, and there's exactly one creature in that world. Like there was Adam, but there was never Eve. Maybe that's not worth it. And so, just because God wills that all would come to know him, it's his desire, it might just not be possible for there to be a world where all come to know him freely. This is why, after Alvin Plantinga wrote his proof, the common way that people talk about it for the last 40 years has been known as the free will defense. The free will defense against the problem of evil. Because it seems to be that God cannot make a world of free creatures where those creatures do not commit evil. At the very least, it's logically possible that that might not be possible. So this corollary is false. It's false in the general, because there are possible worlds, there are incoherent possible worlds. God cannot make a square circle. But also, it's probably false in the context it's trying to care about. It's probably false in the context of stopping evil. Now the other one, there's no possible good to come from evil, we've actually already discussed. And so here's the best defense I can give for the no good can come from evil argument. We've already pointed out scripture that says otherwise. Moreover, coming to know the Lord is an overwhelming good. It's an overwhelming good that will be a good for the rest of eternity for all those who come to know him. Is that worth any amount of pain and suffering for the short period of time that you're on earth? It might be that evil is a beautiful catalyst for people, free creatures, to come to know the Lord. And so it might be that there is a very good reason for evil to exist, and that evil is one of the most powerful catalysts for the ultimate good. So again, the hidden premise is a false one. And now we're back to the ones that everyone agrees are true, but have no contradiction. So this is why the logical problem of evil has been disproven, and it's been formally disproven, which is why today philosophers don't use the problem of evil to defend atheism. Lay people do plenty, but like academically, the proof's a proof. So people have moved on. They've accepted that the problem of evil doesn't work. Now, what they've done, how they've moved on, I think is worth talking about. We've proven that there is no logical problem of evil, but there is what is known, still defended by some today, the probabilistic problem of evil, or the evidential problem of evil. And this claim is slightly different. The claim is something closer to, it's unlikely that God exists, given the amount of evil in the world. Right? And that is, we're not going to talk a whole lot about it, because that is a touchy claim. Because while I hate this argument as something that a theologian makes, it is also a proper response. How could you know that? How could you? Show me the arithmetic. Show me Bayes' theorem. Show me how you deduced that it is unlikely that God exists given the amount of evil in the world. Because I'm sure whatever you did was tenuous at best. This isn't an easy thing to quantify. What I do think is the important discussion in that is the scope of data we care about. So I think one thing where, actually I want to do this really quick. One rebuttal that you'll hear to the pointing out that the problem of evil doesn't work is that's only talking about human evil. What about natural evil? What about storms and tsunamis and tornadoes and ravenous animals? What about natural evil? I have two formal responses to that question. One of them is Genesis 3, I believe 17. It's where God punishes Adam for sin. The very first punishment for sin. Well, the first punishment was given to the serpent, then to the woman, then to Adam. But Adam's punishment was, because you have disobeyed me, you have listened to the woman whom I gave you rather than following my command, the ground will be hard to till for your name's sake. So here's my point. The first sin of humanity physically changed the earth. So I think it's perfectly coherent for a Christian to argue it's possible that there weren't natural disasters prior to sin. It's possible that human sin, human evil, actually is the cause of all evil we experience on earth, other than like satanic evil. Like the serpent was already there. But it's possible that the natural evil that we look at actually is our fault. Now, my other argument, which depending on the person you're interacting with, I think both are logically coherent, and it's just which one's more persuasive, is more simply, evil is a moral statement. It is super weird to attach moral absolutes to non-sentient things. Like, what are you talking about? Are you saying that the tornado is morally wrong? That's what evil is. Evil is being morally wrong. Like, no, it's tragic, it's painful, it causes suffering, but to claim that there's anything moral in nature is super theistic. Like, that is a very, I mean, it's not Christian, but that's a very, like, pantheism view. And so, you're not going to find very many honest atheists who actually want to defend that too much. As soon as you point out to them, that's weird. That is a super weird thing to do. They might just take a single step back. They might concede and say, okay, but it's pain and suffering. So what if we do the same argument with pain and suffering? And say, okay, well, to that, it might be that pain and suffering is a source for an uncalculable good. Going back to the probabilistic problem of evil, I think it's a matter of scope, and this is the current debate that's going on for the probabilistic problem of evil. It's unlikely, it's unreasonable that God exists given the amount of evil in the world. Maybe, but let's take into consideration as much data as we can that's relevant. The question becomes scope. So, if you only consider pain and suffering, there's an argument to be made. There's a whole lot of pain and suffering in the world. And I don't want to make it sound like I don't believe that. Life is brutal. There's a lot of pain and suffering in this world. But if you start taking into account like God's purpose, the concept of eternity, things start to change. So when you realize that most of the evil in the world, even if you don't agree that all of it, comes from humans, and that it's a consequence of being free creatures, then you realize, no, it's actually very reasonable that God exists and there's this much evil because there's a lot of humans, and humans are evil. And that's a consequence of having given us free will. But why would he do that? Because he wants us to freely choose him. When you understand that the purpose of life is not happiness, but it's to know God. When you understand that suffering leads people to God, when you understand that knowing God is an incomparable good, the calculus starts changing and it starts becoming, oh, well, if evil is actually a good catalyst for people to know the Lord, then a whole lot of evil in the world actually would make a lot of sense to be evidence that God exists, rather than evidence that God doesn't exist. It's an open debate. I'm not going to spend any more time on that detail, but I am going to talk about Dr. William Lane Craig's kind of response to the problem of evil, because I think his response is noteworthy. So, Dr. Craig will, in open debates, often have a similar discussion to the one we just had. He'll point out Alvin Plantinga's work. Point out that the proof's in place, there's no argument here anymore, and then he'll take it one step further. Craig says, evil is actually an indirect proof that God exists. And here's why. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Without God, there's no such thing as objective morality. So that's his premise one. Premise two, evil exists. Corollary one from premise two, evil exists. Therefore, objective values exist because the concept of evil is an objective value. And if objective values exist, conclusion is that God exists. Because if God does not exist, then objective values don't exist. But objective values do exist. Therefore, God exists. So Craig actually uses the problem of evil to prove the existence of God. Which 2,000 years ago, the problem of evil was the best argument against theism. In the last 40 years, we've showcased that it's actually a really good argument against atheism. I want to close just with being honest about something that needs to be said whenever you're having this discussion. That is that nothing I just said is helpful. If anyone ever brings up the problem of evil to you, the odds that they care at all about the logic of the problem of evil are about 1%. The odds that they're asking because their mother just died of cancer, or because they just saw some terrible disease that's sweeping through some other country, are really high. And when someone's actually dealing with the emotional problem of evil, the logical problem of evil doesn't really matter. So, if someone ever asks you about the problem of evil, my advice would be, don't just disprove it. Even if they ask it in a very formal way and it seems like they're trying to ask a very logical question. Start by asking them questions about why they're asking. Try to figure out what's going on. Try to get the heart of the problem. And then when you find out that it is some tragic thing that they're dealing with, rather than trying to say, well, God has a plan for that, the best move might be simply to cry with them. Just to admit, I don't understand most of what's going on in this world. And it's hard. God loves you. I love you. I'm here for you. It's often the best you can do. And usually in those situations, bringing up anything that I said today just causes problems. That's my talk. That's what I got for you guys. You got like 15 minutes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. So I think I want to start by saying I know I need to do more research on what Calvinism is because I actually don't think I understand what it is.
Okay.
I think based on what I hear about what Calvinism is, it leads me to confusion about the problem of evil itself if the conversation is about free will. I understand that Calvinism is that God chooses the elect and that we are completely deprived of sin. Completely deprived of any form of goodness. So therefore, only God by his holy hand can reveal himself. And there's scripture that talks about both situations where people were choosing, but also the elect. If there is the elect and we don't have free will, help me understand the framework around this. Or if I need to be humbled and understand more about Calvinism to make this make more sense.
Cool. First, have you watched our video on Calvinism, Arminianism, Wesleyanism, and Molinism? It's about an hour long. I'll send it to you. I think it might be helpful towards just obviously just the Calvinism part. But I did my best to steelman each of the views. I don't think I did a perfect job, but hopefully by watching the video, you can't tell my view, which is accurate if I steelmanned everything well. So I'll say two things to it. You understand at least cursorily the 5 points of Calvinism. Yeah. So there are probably 3 categories you can put Calvinists into. There are Calvinists who will claim to be Calvinists, but they'll claim to be 3 or 4 point Calvinists. There are Calvinists who will claim to be 5 point Calvinists and will defend from the 5 points that there's no such thing as free will. And then there are Calvinists who will say they're 5 point Calvinists and will admit the mystery that they don't understand. I think the best articulation of Calvinism is often an admission that there's something we're missing. And John Piper adds 2 more points to Calvinism. Right? He says that his 6th point is double predestination. So all the 5 points do say that people have been predestined to hell. But then his 7th point is the best possible world. That we are living in the best of all possible worlds. And, well, that's a really Molinist statement. But he's trying to reconcile these problems. Most Calvinists will not be that middle group I described of 5 points and affirming no free will. Most Calvinists will either not affirm all 5 points for that reason, or they will affirm all 5 points but then confess that there's something they're missing. Most Calvinists don't reject free will, though they might reject free will in the case of salvation. which I've had discussions with Calvinists before where I've just asked them, don't you think that that means we have free will in everything that doesn't matter, and we don't have free will in the one thing that matters? And I've never had a good response to that question. I'm not convinced that the free will defense for the problem of evil is incompatible with Calvinism. I think some Calvinists might be. But I think most Calvinists would sit in there's a lot of things that we just don't have the grace to understand. And we affirm the 5 points because the scriptures tell us the 5 points, but the things the scriptures don't tell us. I did this, Grace actually pointed this out to me. I've realized that there's room in the 5 points when you try to make a logical structure, that you can add premises, you can add to it just ideas that fundamentally changes the calculus and changes the drawable conclusions. You can add a premise about like eternity that completely nullifies the concern of double predestination. I'm not saying it's valid, but just the fact that you can means that there's something in there that we don't know. And that's where I would actually think that most Calvinists would land. They'd say the problem of evil is the response to the problem of evil, the free will defense, is a very good defense. I just don't understand how it works. Would probably be what most Calvinists say. I think it's not inherently incompatible, but it's not. You're right. You're right to see tension in it. Some Calvinists would say that it is incompatible.
And that would be the second category.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you're saying that you said clearly for the third category, first category, third, fourth point, they probably are on the same page of like with the third category of saying we don't know. It's mysterious.
Yes, but like one of the things that you usually find when people say they're a Calvinist, but they say they're 3 or 4 point Calvinists, is you'll find that the way they define the points they do affirm and the points that they've rejected were for the point of being able to say humans freely choose God. Like that's usually what makes somebody not a 5 point Calvinist who still claims to be a Calvinist, is to save the capacity for us to have a say in salvation. So they would have an easier time saying the free will defense works because they've rejected a detail or two of Calvinism to be able to say that we have choice. So they'd probably have an easier time with it.
Yeah. I'm going to try to remember that statement you said earlier. Or at least the question you ask Calvinists, and they always seem puzzled. Sure, we don't have free will and salvation, but does he give us free will for everything else we do? Right?
Yeah, it's easy to get Calvinists to defend that view, that we have free will in everything else in life, but not whether or not we choose God. And then, yeah, my response is, so doesn't it feel like that means we have free will everywhere that doesn't matter, and we don't have free will in one place that matters? Actually, literally, every time I've said that to a Calvinist, every time I've had a conversation that's gotten there, the response has been some version of, that's a really good point, I'm going to have to think about that. Like, I've never had someone have a response to it. But I've also never been able to ask, like, John Piper.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I missed the explanation for premise 2. Why does the existence of evil mean objective values exist versus subjective values?
So,
to say that evil exists is to claim that there is something that's objectively wrong. So a moral relativist can't formally use language of good and evil. A moral relativist, in a formal sense, has to use language of preference. And so this is actually a case where Richard Dawkins is really consistent and honest. Not in all cases, but when it's pointed out, he will say, "You're right, I was speaking more casually." Because Richard Dawkins will say, "I can't say that rape is wrong. I can only say that I don't like it." And as soon as you say things like right, wrong, good, evil, you're making objective moral claims. So the claim evil exists is an objective claim. So when the premise is evil exists, then one thing that's logically follows from that, hence therefore, is, well, then objective values exist, because evil is an objective value. So that wasn't defending that there is objective evil, but if we've said that there's objective evil, we've said that there's objective values. Yeah, so, and technically the way that Craig presents this he doesn't even try to defend premise 2. because his interlocutor has already accepted premise 2. They said, how can there be God if evil exists? Okay, so we agree that evil exists. We don't have to prove that. Here's the consequence of evil existing. I don't, by the way, like, to follow where I think the thread's going, I don't even know if I could prove that evil exists. I don't know how I'd go about doing that.
Okay, you moral relativist.
I am not a moral relativist, but I think without just like relying on the scriptures, I don't know how I'd prove it. Like the moral argument for the existence of God is probably the best I've got, but I don't think it's a very good argument, to be honest. I haven't presented it in class, by the way. This is not the moral argument for the existence of God. It's a modification of it. But I'm not. I used to be. I wrote it in my book, but since I just feel like it's a weak argument.
Cross to the classroom.
Classroom to the cross, yeah. Yeah, in the Classroom to the Cross, I write 3 proofs that God exists, and one of them is the moral argument. So here's what I've been persuaded by, what's kind of changed my mind on it. People who have been trying to argue against the moral argument have said, the moral argument is a logical, coherent proof that God exists, but it relies on a premise that is harder to prove than the conclusion. It is harder to prove that morals exist than it is to prove that God exists, regardless of whether or not morals exist. And I think that's right. I think the moral argument is actually a really weak one.
How did you end up defining evil? Just knowing that the first definition that was given was terribly weak.
Yeah, evil can't just be like pain and suffering, right? Pain and suffering are bad things, but that can't encompass evil, right?
Actually, if I stub my toe, that's not evil, but in the definition that was initially given.
Right, exactly. Right. And like we did talk about, I don't think you were here for it. We talked about like how like natural evil is in like self-contradiction almost. Like a tornado isn't evil, right? But the best definition that I have for evil is the Christian definition of evil. It's that which is contrary to God's will.
Cool.
Yeah.
So that wasn't just the definition for a hedonist?
That's how a formal hedonist would define evil, at least historically. They might not today if there's anyone who claims to be a formal hedonist.
But yeah, then I would question, are you actually a hedonist? Right? Because it's like, a hedonist is someone that wants to live a life absent of pain.
Mm-hmm.
So I would question, what are you then? But that's, sorry, I've been mad.
No, I mean, I don't really know if there's formal hedonists anymore. I think the average like person in America is a hedonist, but not in the formal sense of like philosophically rigorous, worked through concepts. I don't know if formal hedonists exist anymore. Watch like someone comments on the video who's like a professor and is like, actually, I teach formal hedonism, but I don't know of any. Every formal hedonist that I've ever heard about is from like ancient Greece. Never heard of one from like the 1700s. Cool. That's dismissed.
Yeah, get him.